My name is Dennis Speed, and on behalf of the Schiller Institute, I want to welcome you to today's event. We are now going to hear second musical selection. Just to say something about those who come to our events for the first time. When you come to a Schiller Institute event, you will be always confronted with music at the beginning of it, unless for some other reason, there's something else that intervenes. There's a reason for that. What we stand for and what you will see today is the change of the character of the American people and the change of the character of all citizens of the world to aspire to the idea that it is through beauty that one proceeds to freedom. We're going to hear now from Frank Mathis, who's going to be doing a selection in German, Franz Schubert on D music. And Frank, I think if you come up, you have the English translation you're going to read for us.
Yep. And Margaret.
Yeah, Margaret Greenspan at the piano.
The song is entitled An die Musik, or To Music. You gentle art, during how many gloomy hours, when life's wild sphere ensnared me, you have aroused my heart to warm love. You've transported me into a better world. Often has a sigh escaping from your harp, a sweet, holy chord from you, opened up for me the heaven of better days to come. You gentle art, I thank you for it. You gentle art, I thank you.
provide the context for today's meeting, I'm going to read a statement which was prepared for the meeting by State Senator Richard Black, the 13th District, State of Virginia, Senate of Virginia. On September 11th, 2001, America suffered the greatest terrorist attack in modern history. In its aftermath, the federal government commissioned a top-level investigation that was intended to get to the bottom of the attacks: who organized them, how they were carried out, how they were financed and executed, and so forth. Seldom has an inquiry held such momentous significance for our nation and its survival. It seemed obvious that the publication of its highly anticipated contents would naturally be widely and publicly disseminated at the earliest moment. Strangely, 28 pages of this vital document were covered up, and their contents were never revealed to the public. This has led to deep suspicions that the 28 pages are an indictment of the undercover activities of a supposed ally of the United States, and that their disclosure may reveal that the U.S. targeted the wrong nation when its troops were sent to attack Iraq, which had little connection to or tolerance for al-Qaeda's sinister activities. Under our founding documents, we the people are supposedly sovereign, but we cannot accurately assess the wisdom of our government's actions if vital information is withheld from us. The federal government has no excuse for withholding the 28-page segment of the 9/11 report. It is time for the American people to know the full story behind the decision-making process for nearly a decade's worth of foreign policy. Warm regards, Richard H. Black, Senator of Virginia, 13th District. Our first speaker today is Diane Sare. Diane has been a congressional candidate twice in the state of New Jersey. She also serves as a policy committee member for the National Policy Committee of the LaRouche Political Action Committee. Diane?
Thanks. I'm sure that everybody here has heard the expression living in a nightmare. And probably most of us would agree that in many ways right now, from ISIS to Ebola to the drought facing the western states, we are experiencing exactly that, living in a nightmare. There's one very important aspect to that expression which I want to emphasize today, which is that a nightmare is a dream. It's not reality. And when you wake up, the nightmare is over. So what am I referring to? Well, as people may know, today it's possible that 45,000 Kurds may be exterminated by ISIS in the city of Kobani as we speak. They're projecting millions of people to die of Ebola. And in Southern California, it's said by the head of the Southern California Metropolitan Water Authority that their reservoirs will be completely out of water within 18 months. Furthermore, many people agree we're headed for the biggest financial and economic blowout ever in history. So, isn't this reality? These disasters can destroy the human race and can destroy civilization. But after they occur, or after we prevent them from occurring, what will be their impact on the future? These events, in and of themselves, have no impact on eternity because they do not define what it means to be human, and they do not have to determine the future development of mankind and the relationship between the human mind and the universe. Lyndon LaRouche has emphasized repeatedly that the past does not determine the future, and that reality itself does not lie in what you perceive with your senses. Let's look at the 30 Years' War. People may have seen paintings from the late 1600s. This was a bloody war, and in all the paintings of that time, everybody in them is missing arms and legs. How did this war end? The Treaty of Westphalia, a treaty of nations where everyone agreed that each nation would act in the interest of the other. Tony Blair has spent his entire adult life trying to eradicate this. Now, is the Treaty of Westphalia the logical outcome of people exterminating each other for actually a century? Was it the result of rage and vengeance that people came up with a treaty which said we should each act in the interest of the other? No. The Treaty of Westphalia came from human creativity. It was something new that did not exist in the past. This breakthrough in human social relations came from the future, and it ended what was really a century of religious war. So how does that work today? Well, many centuries ago, Nicholas of Cusa, who was a great genius and really the founder of modern science, was developed in his Concordantia Catholica the concept of the consent of the governed. This was 300 years before the Declaration of Independence. He came up with this idea because his life was dedicated to understanding God and the relationship between man and God, and he concluded that if man had a direct relationship to God, that a government should have to do with the consent of the governed and not be a dictatorship or a tyranny. Later, Leibniz, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, in the tradition of Cusa, argues in an essay on justice and natural law that justice is a combination of goodness and wisdom, and that goodness is that which contributes to the perfection of sensible substance. In other words, we are good when we contribute to the perfection of other human beings. In our Declaration of Independence, as people know, which Leibniz had a lot to do with, it reads, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." And Leibniz was very clear by happiness, by felicity, he meant the search for wisdom. So we have a government in this country that holds as sacred our right to self-perfection. Now, are these true principles? Are they still true today? Will this still be true long after Obama, Bush, Cheney have all been forgotten? Right now, there is a global American revolution which is being blacked out of the US media. The desperate financial interests who gave us Bush, Obama, and the 9/11 attacks are trying to prevent this American revolution from sweeping into the United States, where I think it will find fertile ground in the hearts and minds of the American people, even as we have been dumbed down and beaten down by pessimism since the events of 9/11/2001. On July 15th in Fortaleza, Brazil, the leaders of 5 very large nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, met and agreed to form a new bank for economic development. But it's not just a bank, it's a paradigm. It's a paradigm based on the principles of Leibniz and Cusa and the work of LaRouche over 40 years. In 1982, when Mr. LaRouche met with President Lopez Portillo of Mexico, Portillo agreed, he nationalized the banks, he agreed to try and create a debt bomb to destroy the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. But Henry Kissinger stepped in and stopped the other nations from joining him, and Portillo was ousted. Later, Indira Gandhi, a close friend of the LaRouches, formerly head of the Non-Aligned Movement and Prime Minister of India, was assassinated in 1984. And in 1989, Mr. LaRouche himself was thrown in prison. The Anglo-Dutch financial oligarchy had not yet become as degenerate and decrepit and bankrupt as it is today. Now with these agreements among the BRICS nations, each nation, instead of standing alone and being cut down, is standing with a block of nations, and many other nations are being drawn into this new gravity. Many of you here attended the speech of the new Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, where you saw 19,000 people packed into Madison Square Garden and another 3,000 people gathered outside. Why? Because he is in the tradition of Mahatma Gandhi, although he is of a different religious background. And his commitment, one, they were the first nation to get an orbiter into Mars orbit on the first try, which is a source of great pride. And also, he is launching a Clean India campaign. He wants to clean the Ganges River. He wants to get the sewage out of the streets. He's building 800 million toilets. Every Indian is going to have indoor plumbing by the anniversary of Gandhi's 150th birthday. So the population of India is very optimistic about the future. China just landed a rover on the moon as part of a 5-step program to get samples from the moon with the prospects of mining helium-3 for the development of nuclear fusion. Russia is also interested in helium-3, and they're building a series of floating nuclear power plants to bring energy to remote parts of the planet not yet inhabited by human beings. South Africa is building 7 new nuclear plants. Nicaragua is building a second Panama Canal, which is going to employ 2 million people in a nation of 6 million, where currently they only have 800,000 people with regular jobs. And Egypt, under President el-Sisi, is now building a second parallel Suez Canal, which will employ 1.5 million people. Unlike many of the projects here, the day after he announced it, there were 7,500 people on the ground digging. There are now 55 construction firms involved, and it's being financed entirely by the people of Egypt, purchasing bonds. And the people of Egypt were so thrilled to be part of building the nation, and Islamic and the Pope of the Coptic Church are united in telling every young person to participate in this. So within 6 days, they raised 2/3 of the money they needed for the canal. Now, President Obama recently met with President el-Sisi here at the UN. He told el-Sisi that he should bring the Muslim Brotherhood back into the government. I think el-Sisi said no. And then finally, Argentina, where people may know the president, Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, has just opened the 3rd nuclear power plant. She stood up to the vulture funds, which were trying to extract a 1,608% rate of profit from the country. She said, we're not going to pay. And our New York judge, who she hints may be senile, Judge Greasy, as I call him, Greasy, here in New York, ordered that Argentina has to pay, and that he's found the whole nation of Argentina in contempt of court. She courageously told the people of Argentina that they may next try to arrest her while she is here, that she is being told that ISIS has threatened to assassinate her, and she said there's no such evidence. If I am killed, she said, look to the north. But she is not standing alone. She has the backing of 2/3 of the world's population. So I am convinced if more Americans were aware of the fact that 5 billion people on this planet have woken up and gotten out of the nightmare, that Obama and half of the Congress would be thrown out in a flash. I think these developments are being blacked out from the US media for exactly this reason. And I would ask that all of us here carefully consider what Jeff Steinberg and Terry Strada have to tell us and commit ourselves to winning this war. I think the people of the United States can be won over to defend the future of mankind. One, because these are the principles upon which our nation was founded, and more importantly, because our nation was founded on principles designed to promote human creativity, which is actually the passion of all people on this planet. Thank you.
just one announcement for those who are watching us via Google Hangouts. If there be any technical problem and the feed happens to go down, fear not, we will have captured the entire feed. You will be able to get it later. That's just in the event that that may occur. We wanted to make sure it's a public service announcement that we let people know that. Before introducing the next speaker, I want to read a statement prepared for this meeting by Congressman Walter Jones. I think everyone here should know that Congressman Walter Jones is the author of House Resolution 428, which is the resolution that is calling for the release of the 28 pages of which we've spoken earlier. He says, "The recent anniversary of the tragic events of September 11th, 2001 has once again raised the myriad of questions that still remain unanswered regarding that terrible day. After 13 years, it is long past time for the American people to get the full truth about the worst attack ever committed on American soil. The need for transparency is greater than ever. To that end, I have created a bipartisan coalition of members dedicated to declassifying 28 pages of the Congressional Joint Inquiry into 9/11 that were initially removed under President George W. Bush and have remained classified under President Barack Obama. Having read these pages myself, I know without a doubt that their publication would not pose a threat to national security. Rather, these pages contain information that is critical to our foreign policy moving forward, that the American people have the right to know. More importantly, this information will help to bring closure to the many individuals who lost family and friends in the attacks or survived the attacks themselves, many of whom are here today. Along with Representative Stephen Lynch, I have introduced House Resolution 428, which calls on the President to declassify the 28 pages. This bipartisan resolution has garnered support from not only current members of Congress, but also from former Senator Bob Graham, who co-chaired the Congressional Joint Inquiry and has been calling for the declassification of the pages for years. More recently, the co-chairs of the 9/11 Commission, Governor Tom Kean and Congressman Lee Hamilton, who used the Congressional Joint Inquiry to inform their investigation, have called on the pages to be declassified. In addition, the resolution has gained perhaps the most important endorsement of all, that of the 9/11 victims and families of victims. I want to sincerely thank each of you for your advocacy and ask you to please contact your member of Congress and ask that they join in support of this effort to provide the American people with the truth. On September 9th, there was a press conference in Washington, D.C., which was attended by the next speaker. Terry Strada's husband was killed at the World Trade Center. She has campaigned as co-chairman of a group in New Jersey, the 9/11 Families for Truth. And we are more than deeply honored to have her here with us today. Terry Strada.
Thank you very much. My name is Terry Strada. It's an honor to be here today. I do co-chair the National 9/11 Families and Survivors United for Justice Against Terrorism. On behalf of over 6,000 family members and survivors, I would like to address the 28 pages with all of you today. Last December, Congressman Jones and Stephen Lynch did introduce this House Resolution 428, and I want to tell you why House Resolution 428 is so important and why we need it to pass. I did suffer a heartbreaking loss on 9/11. My husband Tom was killed while working in the North Tower of the World Trade Center for Cantor Fitzgerald. Tom was a wonderful, loving, kind man. We had 3 young children. They were 7, 4, and 4 days old on September 11th. And we miss him each and every day. Because of 9/11, my children are 3 of 3,000 children who suffered the loss of a parent at the hands of terrorism and are growing up without a mother or father today. Ground Zero rescue workers are sick and dying to this day, even after 13 years, the death toll continues to rise. I stand here today because I don't believe people should get away with murder, and that is exactly what has happened. The people who gave financial, material, and logistical support to the 19 hijackers are free from any accountability. There has been no justice, and no one has been punished for the murder of thousands of innocent men, women, and children here in America, in our country, on our soil. I stand here today representing all Americans. We cannot continue to allow our government to keep classified the most crucial facts of the worst terrorist attacks on American soil. Incredibly, for over a decade, we have been denied the truth behind who else was part of the planning and implementation. Why was the decision made to keep the truth from my family and the American people? Sadly, the answer has become painfully clear. Our government is more concerned with protecting the Saudi regime from embarrassment or any public penalty than protecting the American people from terrorist complicity. Contrary to what our government has allowed us to believe, Al-Qaeda did not act alone. Long before 9/11, there was a complex financial network of wealthy individuals, banks, and so-called charities established to give financial aid, material, and logistical support to the 19 hijackers who lived here amongst us for nearly 2 years, renting apartments and cars, taking flying lessons, and buying first-class plane tickets to practice and then carry out their heinous acts of murder. From Los Angeles, San Francisco, California, Little Falls, Virginia, and Sarasota, Florida, 9/11 operatives were supported through a network of members likely named in those 28 pages and many others not named. They had help, and a lot of it. We believe those pages will show where that help came from: Saudi Arabia. This is not an academic question. We don't simply want to know the answer. The truth must be exposed if our leaders are to navigate the thorny problems of an increasingly dangerous world. Al-Qaeda is pure evil, and so are their bankers. The war in Afghanistan was a direct result of 9/11. This war has cost the American taxpayers nearly $2 trillion and over 2,000 soldiers' lives. Is it possible that after years of war, we will never know who else was behind the terrorist attacks here that prompted this declaration of war? For 13 long and painful years, we have been shut out from knowing who else is responsible for 9/11 and have requested our presidents to unlock the truth behind the half-story we were told and expected to believe. We are tired but undaunted in our fight to bring these facts to life. Although every day I ask myself, wasn't the violent murder of 3,000 souls enough to make our government do the right thing? Well, apparently not. This classification of the foreign support chapter of the Joint Inquiry Report was ordered under the Bush administration and has continued under the Obama administration. There's plenty of blame to go around, and it's time to stop coddling rich oil states funding terrorism. It's time for the world to know who funded and is still funding Al-Qaeda and ISIS and other terrorist groups. As Congressman Jones and Lynch have both said publicly, they do not believe anything in this report jeopardizes national security. These are honorable public servants, and I believe them. It is our responsibility as victims, family members, and survivors of 9/11, and concerned citizens like you, to fight for the truth to be told. It is our government's responsibility to expose the other criminals of 9/11, the bankrollers, no matter who they may be. We are not alone in our request for these 28 pages to be declassified. On August 1st, 2003, 10 years ago, Senators Chuck Schumer and Sam Brownback asked for the declassification of these 28 pages. 44 other senators signed that letter, including former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and current Secretary of State John Kerry. I've never done this before, but I do have the letter here, and I'd like to read it today. So this is the letter that was written to George Bush back in 2003. Like I said, signed by Chuck Schumer, Sam Brownback, and 44 other senators. We have it here. Dear President Bush, we write to respectfully request that the Bush administration declassify a key 28-page section of the joint inquiry into intelligence community activities before and after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. While we respect the reasons to keep information classified, be it the protection of sources and methods or the maintenance of the integrity of ongoing investigations, such purposes can be accomplished through responsible, selective redaction rather than effacing the section's contents totally. According to the Joint Inquiry Report, the contents of the redacted pages detail specific sources of foreign support for some of the September 11th hijackers while they were here in the United States. Unfortunately, because all but 2 pages of the entire section have been deemed too secret for public disclosure, the American people remain in the dark about other countries that may have facilitated the terrorist attacks. It has been widely reported in the press that the foreign sources referred to in this portion of the Joint Inquiry analysis reside primarily in Saudi Arabia. As a result, the decision to classify this information sends the wrong message to the American people about our nation's anti-terror effort and makes it seem as if there will be no penalty for foreign abettors of the hijackers. As you are aware, Saudi Arabia's banks and charities have been used to funnel money to Al-Qaeda. Its Madrish schools spew hateful anti-American rhetoric to would-be suicide bombers across the Middle East, and 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudis. Given these facts, protecting the Saudi regime by eliminating any public penalty for the support given to terrorists from within its borders would remain a mistake. If we are to protect our national security, we must convince the Saudi regime to get tough on terror, keeping private its involvement, or that of any other nation in the September 11th attacks, is not the way to accomplish this goal. We respectfully urge you to declassify the 28-page section that deals with foreign sources of support for the 9/11 hijackers. That was written 10 years ago, and we now are pushing for Obama to hopefully release them. We believe that not declassifying these 28 pages is far more of a threat to our national security than keeping them classified. We have written to the President on 3 separate occasions. He has remained silent to our letters. He has not responded at all. We are now writing to the National Defense Department and so forth, and we've been told that they're looking into it, and that's all the information we've gotten, but no action to date has taken place. I thank you very much.
So why, if that letter was written 10 years ago? And why, if all of the documentation is available in various ways to the Senate and the House of Representatives? And why, if there are some 18 or so House of Representatives members, congressmen, who've read these pages and have all concluded that there's nothing within them that needs to be classified? And why, if the chairman of the commission, of the Joint Commission, who chaired it, who's now a former senator, former governor, also Bob Graham, has said he wants them released? And why, if you live in a free nation called the United States, in which these things are supposed to be done on your behalf, both the protection of the country and the investigations as to the attacks on the country, why is it that nothing has happened? Jeff Steinberg, Senior Counterintelligence Editor for Executive Intelligence Review, has a 40-year history of investigations, worked with Lyndon LaRouche for over 40 years, Lyndon LaRouche being the founder of Executive Intelligence Review. Jeff has written extensively on many, many topics. If you go online and you Google his article, Saudi Arabia, about Prince Bandar and 9/11, you'll see some of the material there. And so Jeff is going to come and give us the answer to that question. Why? Jeff?
I think it was 3 or maybe 4 years ago. I was just back in Leesburg, Virginia, and stopped into a local store where I happened to know the owner. And we started talking, and the first words out of his mouth were, "Where were you 47 years ago today?" And I looked at him like he was probably crazy or something. I mean, how am I going to remember something that happened 47 years ago? And then I realized that the date was November 22nd, and that 47 years ago to the day was when Kennedy was assassinated. And every instant of that day came back to my mind vividly. It was one of those rare moments of collective shock and trauma that hit an entire nation and had consequences beyond anybody's imagination that, you know, have gone on for years and for decades afterwards. For the 21st century, for the early years of the 21st century, September 11th, 2001 was the same thing. And I bet if we had time to simply go around the room, every single person here, I don't see anybody who probably wasn't born yet on 9/11/2001, would similarly be able to say precisely, almost minute by minute, what happened. And so I think to begin to get at the question of why it is that here we are 13 years later and we're still scratching our heads as to why a president from the opposing party would have been so adamant about making promises directly to family members. Friends, close collaborators of Terry were in the room, in the Oval Office, when the president was asked directly in one of his first weeks in office, "Will you declassify the 28 pages?" And he said to their faces, "Yes." At a later event, inaugurating the 9/11 memorial at Ground One, other members of the family group raised the exact same question with the president, and they got the same answer. Yet, in point of fact, there's no indication whatsoever that President Obama has any intention of acting on the basis of the demands of the families, the demands of 46 current and former members of the U.S. Senate, leading representatives of the House of Representatives, and the overwhelming majority of the American people. And I think I've had a number of discussions in the last several months or so with members of Congress who read the 28 pages. And I'll give you a little bit of a secret about how even that came about, to get an idea of the sort of bodyguard of lies and cover-up that has prevailed around these 28 pages for the last 13, 14 years. Probably 5 years ago, colleagues of mine filed a Freedom of Information Act request demanding the declassification of the 28 pages. And it went through various stages of the FOIA process. And after about 3.5 years, it finally reached the level of a National Security Review Board that's actually at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., which is the sort of Supreme Court over Freedom of Information Act requests. And they were the ultimate judge on whether or not these pages should be declassified. And what we got back was a rather stunning letter from them. They said, "We're sorry you've wasted your time for all these years because this is not an executive branch document. This is a document that was produced by the U.S. Congress, and the particular jurisdiction we have for review is only over the executive branch. So we're sorry you wasted all this time, but basically you've got to go to Congress and ask them to get the documents declassified." Now here's where it got tricky, because we showed that letter to a number of members of Congress, including Congressman Walter Jones, and so they said, well, fine, if it's a congressional document, we know it was classified by the White House. It was reviewed at the Bush-Cheney White House, and that's where the decision was made to put the lid on the 28 pages. But it is a congressional document, and so initially Congressman Jones and Congressman Frank Wolf from Virginia contacted the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Mike Rogers, and the ranking Democrat, Dutch Ruppersberg, and they said, well, it's a congressional document, we want to see it. They went back and forth, and it was literally a pitched battle for a period of 3 months, and finally, in July of last year, Rogers agreed that the members would be allowed to actually come in and read the 28 pages. They were practically forced to leave their clothes at the door in order to get into the secured room where they were basically no pencils, no recording devices, absolutely nothing except you're sitting there in a room with 2 federal agents watching over you, and you read the 28 pages, you get up and you leave. So at this point, well over 20 members of Congress, at least, and those are members that we've spoken to directly, who we know read the pages because they told us. And the response from those members of Congress has been pretty much universal. Number one, they said that we absolutely agree that there is no legitimate basis for keeping these 28 pages classified. And number two, they said that by the mere act of reading those 28 pages, our lives were changed, and we have been forced to rethink everything that we thought we knew about the history of this country and the world over the last 20 or so years. Now, the members are very careful because they know that they are treading on very dangerous territory. And so they have been extraordinarily careful not to say a word about the content of those 28 pages. And the only thing that I can conclude from some other comments that were made by members, I won't give specific names, but several members said that these 28 pages have clearly implications for our relations with Saudi Arabia. But there are implications that are even more disturbing that relate to the internal politics and internal security of the United States. And they said, we can't say anything more, but Stephen Lynch at the press conference that Terry and a number of the other family members were at said something very similar, that his entire view of the history that he's not only followed but has lived through as a member of Congress over this past several decades is completely different in his mind, having read these 28 pages. Now, what that tells me is that while there are significant things about these 28 pages that we do know, there are a lot more elements within this that we don't know, and I'm not going to even try to speculate on what they may be. But I think it just convinces me that the urgency of getting these 28 pages released is clearer in my mind than it has ever been. And I'm convinced that there is a lot more in those pages than simply what we know or surmise about the role of the Saudis. The fact of the matter is that much of the involvement of officials of the Saudi government, of the Saudi Arabian General Intelligence Directorate, of the Saudi Ministry of Defense, leading members of the Saudi royal family who are owners of major banks and charities that poured money into the 9/11 hijackers, a lot of this stuff is pretty well known, frankly. Elements of what's in the 28 pages were very cleverly presented by Senator Bob Graham in his 2004 book called Intelligence Matters. And what he did is provided a narrative of his experience as chairman of the Joint Committee at one point he described how two of the chief investigators for his 9/11 Joint House-Senate Committee were both FBI agents on loan from the Bureau to work on his staff. They were very serious, competent, and honest investigators. And they also happened to know the ins and outs of how you read an FBI document, having written many of them themselves. They were out in Los Angeles at the FBI office, and Senator Graham described that he received a phone call from them, and he was down in Florida back in his district at the time, and they said, "You've got to go to a secure phone line. We can't wait. We have to tell you right away what it is that we just discovered in these FBI files." And so, ironically, he had to go to the local FBI office, which was the nearest place where there was a secure phone line. And what they told him was that they had found certain documents that made it very clear that the Saudi ambassador at that time, Prince Bandar bin Sultan, the son of the Saudi Minister of Defense, had provided funds that had gone to two known Saudi intelligence officers in the San Diego area, and that those funds had been used to finance at least two, probably three, of the 9/11 hijackers. And that this was, deeply disturbing, and that the material was there in the FBI files. So this was a big deal, and in the course of describing that experience as chairman, he was able to get out some very important information about this whole investigation and some glimmers of what's in the 28 pages. A few days later, the same two FBI agents on his staff called him back and said, "You got to get to the FBI office again and get on a secure line, because we found something else that's really, really stunning." And when he got to the secure phone, he was told that two of the 9/11 hijackers, in fact, the first two hijackers to arrive in the United States, who had received the finances directly from the Saudi ambassador in the United States through two known Saudi intelligence agents, and that the money had been used to pay for the rent, to buy car, get licenses, and even to start pilot training for two of these hijackers. It turns out that the same two Saudi intelligence agents had arranged for them at one point to get rooms in the home of another Saudi businessman who was living in the San Diego area. And it turned out that that Saudi businessman, who was hosting two of the 9/11 hijackers for months and months and months, was an FBI informant. So there were layers to this story, and now, of course, this is months after the 9/11 attacks, and none of this had been previously made public. It was not made public by the FBI or anybody else. So all of these elements started coming together, and these are things that are out there in the public. We know that the two original 9/11 hijackers, named Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Midar, arrived directly on a flight from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, where they were presumably at a meeting where the whole 9/11 operation was planned out. They were met nearby Los Angeles International Airport by two Saudi intelligence officers, Omar al-Bayoumi and Osama Baznan. Now, these guys were known entities. They were known to be working for the Saudi government, yet they also had very unsavory track records of their activity in the United States. In particular, Osama Baznan came to the United States on a tourist visa in 1980 and stayed here. So in other words, he was working for the Saudi government. He was an illegal. And in 1992, while he was living in Washington, D.C., he hosted a reception for the blind sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman, who was involved in the 1990s World Trade Center bombing. So he had basically a profile as a paid employee of the Saudi government, and at the same time was himself under watch by the FBI. We happen to know that through some contacts of our own inside the Arab diplomatic community in Washington, that at one point Bosnan was busted on cocaine trafficking out in Southern California. This was prior to the 9/11 attacks. And there was a direct intervention by the Saudi ambassador, Prince Bandar bin Sultan, to make sure that the charges were dropped and he was basically let go. So there's a rich profile here. The other Saudi intelligence agent named Omar al-Bayoumi was here in the United States from the early 1990s as an official employee of the Saudi Ministry of Defense. And he worked for a Saudi-owned company called Dala Aviation out in California. He was a no-show employee. He was drawing $3,000-4,000 a month plus a much, much larger expense account, yet never showed up on the job. And when some company executives filed a complaint about it, the Saudi Defense Ministry said that if they made any move to remove him from his position, that all of their contracts in the United States would be cut. So there are many, many levels of this story that are absolutely known through a variety of other avenues. They all point to a publicly documented, absolutely damning case against the Saudis. There's other elements to this story as well that came up through a somewhat separate process of investigation that began a number of years ago, having to do with corrupt business practices involving the British defense company BAE and the Saudi Ministry of Defense. And again, the central figure in the story was Prince Bandar, the same Bandar who sent at least $50,000 to $75,000 in checks that are documented to the 9/11 hijackers through al-Bayoumi and Bosnan, beginning in 1998, but extending through the whole period that the terrorist hijackers were in the country. In 1985, Prince Bandar negotiated a major arms deal between Britain and Saudi Arabia. It was called al-Yamama, which is the Arab word for the dove. And under this arrangement, which was a barter deal, BAE Systems, over a period of years and decades, provided the Saudi Ministry of Defense with about $40 billion in military equipment. And on top of that $40 billion in actual equipment, they padded the bills for another approximately $20 billion that were in the form of payoffs and kickbacks to the Saudis, to various princes and officials of the defense ministry. In return, the Saudis provided 600,000 barrels of crude oil a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, beginning in the spring of 1985 and presumably continuing right up to this day. Now, we looked up very simply on publicly available charts what was the actual price on the international spot market for that oil, because basically under the agreement, under this al-Yamama program, British Petroleum and Royal Dutch Shell took delivery of that oil and immediately turned around and sold it on the world market. Well, between the $40 billion in arms and $20 billion in bribes, there was still an excess of well over $100 billion in excess profits from the sales on the spot market of this oil. Unfortunately, Prince Bandar is a bit of a narcissist. And so he was preparing to leave the U.S. and come back to Saudi Arabia and was going to try to get himself a very cushy job in the inner circles around the royal family. And so he commissioned a friend, a British writer, who he had gone to school with in England, to write an official authorized biography. And there was an entire chapter in that book that bragged about the fact that this Al-Yamama deal was a stroke of genius, because after the arms were delivered, after the oil was sold, there was $100 billion or so that resided in various offshore bank accounts to finance different kinds of, quote, anti-communist operations around the world. The first one they began funding in a big way was the Afghan Mujahideen, some of which later morphed into Al-Qaeda. So you've got a larger story here. As bad as the Saudi story itself is, as bad as the cover-up and complicity by American officials is, there's deeper issues here that are yet to be really fleshed out. During the period that Bandar and his wife, Princess Haifa, were funneling money just to these 9/11 hijackers on the West Coast, he was at the same time receiving at minimum $2 billion in commission fees on the Al-Yamama deal that he brokered between Britain and Saudi Arabia. And it happened that the bank that they were using for those transactions, Riggs National Bank in New York, came under investigation for all kinds of corruption charges. And as the result of that, bank records were seized. And so there's an available paper trail. There was a congressional report and other documents on this showing funds being transferred from the Bank of England, the accounts of this Al-Yamama project, through the British Ministry of Defense, into Bandar's personal accounts at Riggs National Bank in Washington, D.C., during the period that all of the prep work for the 9/11 attacks was going on. Now, what are the levels of complicity in terms of different people? Who knew in advance that this was happening? There was another incident that occurred several years after the 9/11 attacks. Actually, not that long after. On March 28th, 2002, one of the top 3 or 4 people in Al-Qaeda from the time of the 9/11 attacks was captured in Pakistan. And he was the first trial balloon for the renditions and waterboarding and all of this stuff. His name was Abu Zubaydah. And at one point, since they were having trouble getting any information out of him, they decided they were going to really scare him. So he had no idea where he was. He had been basically captured, and his face was covered with a hood, and he was taken somewhere. He didn't know what part of the world he was in. So they set up an interrogation room that was designed to give the appearance that he was in Saudi Arabia. And they had several members of the interrogation team who were Arab and spoke fluent Arabic and spoke with a Saudi accent. And so what they expected was that he was going to really be terrified that he was back in Saudi Arabia and that he would be tortured to death, way beyond anything the CIA had done to him. And to the shock of the interrogators, the minute that he came to the conclusion that he was in Saudi Arabia, this great big smile came on his face, and he was immediately relieved, and he started rattling off the names of various Saudi princes who needed to be called up right away because they would make sure he was freed because there was a terrible mistake here. And the interrogators were completely shocked. They took the information down, and they checked it out, and it turned out that they were, in fact, the private home phone number and the private cell phone number of a very high-ranking leading member of the Saudi royal family. They went back into him and said, well, the numbers were fake, they don't work, tell us what you really know. And he started rattling off the names of 6 other members of the leading circles in the Saudi royal family who he said All of these people are my contacts. They know who I am. Call them up and they'll tell you to let me go. So, in other words, what I'm saying is that we are looking at something much bigger, and the 28 pages represent the window into an entirely different picture of how the world works. And it goes way beyond simply political embarrassment. You know, the FBI messed up and, you know, let an informant house 2 9/11 hijackers. How could that terrible thing have happened? Well, you know, the FBI went to great lengths to cover up the story. They put the FBI informant in the Federal Witness Protection Program. They whisked him off under a new identity, and Senator Graham's researchers never got a chance to interview him. They couldn't even interview the FBI agents who were the case handlers. So there's lots of things that happen that could be written off as bad judgment, bad mistakes, bureaucratic cover-up, all of those kinds of things. But the sense you get from the people who read these 28 pages is that there is something much, much bigger in their content that opens up a big issue. Clearly, one question is the continuing U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia. Clearly, another issue is that the Bush-Cheney administration was hell-bent on overthrowing Saddam Hussein, and so Saddam Hussein became the target to go after as revenge for 9/11, although there was no evidence he had anything to do with it. It's as if, following Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt ordered the bombing of France. I mean, think about it. 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudis. 2 days after the 9/11 attacks, they were escorted out of town. And in fact, the Saudi intelligence officers who were directly implicated in the 9/11 attacks were in fact directly involved in coordinating the arrangements to get the members of the bin Laden family and other Saudi royals out of the country on the very first flight that was allowed in the air after the 9/11 attacks. So, while many people say, yes, the 28 pages because it will reveal more of the truth about the Saudis, that's totally true. And it almost goes without saying that widespread public disclosure of that will force a fundamental change in the U.S. relationship with the Saudis, perhaps even with the British, around the whole nature of Londonistan and the nature of this Al-Yamama deal, which created some of the funding mechanisms that may very well, we don't know for sure, but may very well have commingled with other funds for 9/11. But my gut sense is that we're dealing with something much bigger, and it makes it even more absolutely urgent that we move heaven and earth to get these 28 pages released. The families are fully active. Many of you may have seen the press conference that took place in Washington on September 9th. Terry was there with 2 of her children, and there were a number of other family members. One of them, was it Matt Solito? Yeah. Basically stood in front of the camera and said, "Mr. President, you're a liar. You promised us you'd release the 28 pages. It hasn't happened." That's my definition of a liar. So we've moved this process forward, I think, a great long way. The House of Representatives has a bill. There's a growing number of sponsors. My understanding is that there are a number of additional signatures that will be officially added as soon as Congress comes back at the end of the first week in November. So the momentum is there, and I just want to end by saying that it is of monumental importance. We will not get to the truth of many things that are horribly wrong in this world and in this country until we get these 28 pages opened up. And as I say, don't be surprised to find that there are things in there that go beyond your imagination. in terms of what it was that those investigators discovered and what it was that was covered up. So we have a very important mission on our hands, and I want to make sure that people don't underestimate the historic importance of winning this fight and winning this fight in the immediate weeks ahead.